But Martin, I think probably best to start this week talking about this MH17 business, because it's been in the news today. I mean, this is quite an interesting scenario here, where effectively NATO countries and Ukraine are investigating a crash. The Russians are not.
Well, in actual fact, there is an international procedure for investigating these incidents, but the West has chosen not to follow that international procedure.
Why isn't it aviation?
Because they don't want to follow it.
Why is it the Dutch Foreign Minister making these announcements, not the aviation?
Because what they've done is they've set up their own investigation based upon what they think is what they want to do, which is not, in fact, the rules of international aviation investigations, in which, of course, everybody would have some kind of a say and be able to input stuff. And the Russians, of course, have actually supplied them with lots of information that they've gathered, which has all been ignored in this so-called, result, as you might call it. It still seems incredibly implausible what they're saying. They're saying that we know that the Ukraine, it probably wasn't shot down by a Buk missile, but the only Buk missiles in the zone were all Ukrainian army Buk missiles. They were actually, they were original Soviet production.
This is not what they've said today. They've said that a Russian missile battery came over the border, shot down the plane, and then went back over the border. Although they've got no evidence for that whatsoever. But there was a fact that several Ukrainian missile batteries were in the zone. But I think the real truth of the matter is it was shot down by a plane, because BBC Russia had correspondents on the ground who got eyewitnesses to say they saw the plane being shot down by a fighter from Kiev. This was actually uploaded online. It was shown.
Yes, that's right. It was shown in Russia, but then BBC London closed down what BBC Russia had already uncovered, and of course none of that made it into this kangaroo court report, which we're now being forced to accept as some kind of, the Russians obviously shot down the plane because that's a sort of evil thing that they do, being as evil as they are.
The pilot that the Russians have accused of flying the Sukhoi jet that shot it down, allegedly, with a cannon apparently, rather than a missile, although possibly a missile too. We reported this just 2-3 months ago, didn't we, that he'd committed suicide.
Well, yes, he's dead. Let's put it that way. Whether he committed suicide is another question. It's very hard. My copper's hunch about all of this, and, again, it's speculative. There's not been a proper investigation. There should have been a proper investigation. Dutch journalists went out there and they gathered lots of information which didn't cover the story that the Dutch government is now coming out with, and they had all of their material confiscated. Audio, video, everything confiscated when they came back from the region. And none of that, of course, made it into this.
Talking about the Ukraine,
report,
which is where all this happened, obviously there were several things to do with this, where a strange diversion of the plane northwards, more towards the war zone, and also to ask the pilot to actually to reduce his altitude as well, in order to, I suppose, possibly to allow this plane to get to him. But the main problem here is this chap, Andriy Parubiy. He was the chairman of the National Security Council in Ukraine at the time, and he resigned, I think it was about 3 or 4 weeks afterwards, without giving any explanation. Who is this guy?
Well, he's basically a fascist operative, a big cheese in that sort of circles, but he also works very closely with NATO intelligence services, and he's become the Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament, which means he can't be prosecuted for anything that he does. Now, but he's also heavily implicated in the trade union hall massacre in Odessa, for example.
Well, he was also the commandant of the Maidan protest.
Indeed. Also, probably there's been a court case in Kiev in which the Berkut riot police have been acquitted of shooting the demonstrators because their defence lawyers were able to get evidence which was put through by Skype from Georgia, of people from Georgia who said that we were mercenaries and we were paid money, supposedly being paid money to carry out these. We shot both police officers and demonstrators from various various buildings which were under the control of Pravi sector, which Parubiy heads up. And the evidence in that court case shows that the people were shot not by the previous Yanukovych regime, but by people associated with the new regime, specifically Parubiy and his cohorts. and they killed those people. And if you think about it, they're prepared to kill pro-EU demonstrators. Are they prepared to shoot down aeroplanes? Yes, especially if they're working closely with NATO intelligence services, which is clear that they are. So surely NATO intelligence services wouldn't do things like that. Well, I have to tell you, if you believe that, then I've got a suspension bridge to sell you. They have been doing that stuff for years, not just in the Ukraine.
One of the key things to do with MH17 was that the Ukrainian air traffic control refused to release the audio transcripts.
Indeed, and the black boxes...
Well, actually, no, to be fair, they released some transcripts, but they wouldn't release the original audio, so various investigators could see if a transcript
edited, without the original audio doesn't mean anything, does it?
I mean, if you release the audio of the conversations with air traffic control and the aircraft, it's very easy then to detect if that has been edited.
Yeah. Well, let's put it this way. There is a procedure for investigating all of these kind of incidents. It's written into international agreements and laws. None of that procedure has been followed. Effectively, just like the Skripal case or the Duma chemical weapons attack that wasn't, basically what happens is NATO makes up its own stories and then presents them to the world as if that's the gospel truth, and anybody else who's saying anything else is clearly, an evil liar, and we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. Can't you see our white hats? Can't you see their black hats? And of course, it does enough to keep the ball rolling, but it doesn't convince anybody in Russia, I can assure you.
Somebody calling themselves Bellingcat has said that it has identified conclusively that 50-year-old Russian military officer Oleg Ivanikov was in charge of military operations in eastern Ukraine when the MH17 was shot down over separatist-controlled territory on the 17th of July 2014. He was on active duty in eastern Ukraine as an officer in the main intelligence directorate, GRU, of the General Staff of the Russian Defence Military. He said he held the post during an undercover deployment into eastern Ukraine.
Well, I'm not suggesting that it may be that it was an undercover deployment. I don't know one way or the other. But the point is they're claiming that it was a Russian missile battery. And the Russian missile batteries would have had to drive into East Ukraine. Don't forget the Americans have got satellites and everything. It drove into East Ukraine, shot down the plane and then drove back into Russia. Meanwhile, of course, you've got seven different batteries of exactly the same kind of missile which have been deployed by the Ukrainians.
So anyway, who is this Bellingcat and why is just a minute, and why is he telling this through Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty? Who are they?
Well, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty are essentially the propaganda arm of NATO in Eastern Europe. They always were in the Soviet era, they still are now. Bellingcat has actually got no credibility as a...
His real name is Eliot Higgins.
Yes, Eliot Higgins basically was made redundant from his job in IT or something, and then because he was bored, he sat at home on the internet and became an expert on military matters, apparently.
He's a verified news gatherer by Google. They've said he's definitely not fake news.
He's being used to push these NATO lines on virtually everything to do with Syria and Ukraine, but he's actually got no background in any of this at all, and he's never been to any of these countries. And it's a bit like the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is one guy working from his house in Coventry. What we've actually got here is a huge psychological warfare operation by NATO. Coming back to the original Maidan sniper attack, the Russians got hold of a telephone intercept which was verified by Agence France-Presse to be true by Umas Piets, phoning up Catherine Ashton, who was Umas Piets, the Estonian foreign minister. They're very hostile to the Russians, so they had no reason to lie. Phoning Catherine Ashton saying, well, we've just been round the hospitals, and what everybody's telling us is that the people who carried out the murders were snipers associated with the new regime, not the old regime. And he confirmed to Agence France-Presse that the call was genuine. In other words, from the get-go, NATO have been playing fast and loose with everything. Okay. Killing people, killing innocent people, demonstrators, the people, counter-demonstrators in Odessa, a huge massacre there, and of course they shot down the plane in order to make
the Russians look Martin, bad. Why haven't the Russians made more of this?
The Russians have done everything they can to try and reasonably and calmly explain why what you're saying is nonsense. But the point is that if the whole point of this propaganda campaign is whatever Russian says, it must be wrong. Yeah? And there's plenty of stupid people out there. If the government tells them black is white, then black is white. Their knowledge of the matters is pretty limited. Their knowledge of what the Russians are or are not comes from James Bond's film they watch every Christmas, and that's about it. The reality on the ground in places like Ukraine is a long way from what Middle England believes.
We'll talk about Syria in a minute, but first North Korea and this summit being cancelled. Well, Moon Jae-in from South Korea is perplexed as Trump cancels a summit with Kim. One of the things I've not heard on any of the mainstream coverage is that Trump has pulled out of this just literally immediately after the North Koreans have supposedly destroyed their nuclear testing site. So he's waited until this nuclear testing site has all been destroyed. They've had various journalists there watching things being blown up. And now Trump says, I'm pulling out the summit now.
Well, what's happened is that Trump basically is a loose cannon. So what the South Koreans...
Well, there are suggestions that actually it's John Bolton that's...
Well, exactly, that's what I'm saying. That Trump's a loose cannon. What the South Koreans did was very smart. They went to talk to Kim Jong-un, and then the people who went to talk to Kim Jong-un said, right, we're going to...
No, they weren't harsh. I mean, they re-imported the warlords who'd been involved with the drugs trade in the early 90s. The CIA had encouraged them to plant poppy in order to fund the war against the Russians, as they'd done in Vietnam, Laos, and other places in Southeast Asia during the 60s. And it was basically a cardboard cutout of what was going on in those countries in the 60s. And the CIA has a long history, they used to call it Air America, of exporting drugs as used as off-the-books revenue. It's quite an important factor in the international...